The wind had no mercy. It was a living thing in this God-forsaken expanse of Texas, a malevolent spirit that scoured the land, picking up grit and sand and hurling it into the faces of the unworthy. Clara Mae Thompson felt its sting on her chapped lips and in her raw, tired eyes. For weeks, it had been her constant companion, its howl the only lullaby for her fitful sleep, its breath the thief of the last moisture from her skin. She shifted the weight of her son, Samuel, on her hip. He was 5, but small for his age, his body a frail, warm bundle against her own. His head, topped with a mop of sun-bleached brown hair, rested heavily in the crook of her neck. He didn't complain. Not anymore. He had learned, as she had, that the wilderness did not care for complaints. It only answered with more silence, more heat, more wind. Behind them, a sound as weary as the landscape itself, the slow, shuffling tread of hooves, her inheritance, the last will and testament of a man she'd tried to love. 12 head of longhorn cattle, their ribs stark beneath their dusty hides, their horns like skeletal branches reaching for a sky that offered no rain. They were what was left of her husband's dreams. Dreams that had withered and died in the brutal chill of the last winter, taking him along with them. Now they were her burden and her only hope, a pathetic caravan trailing a desperate woman across a land that swallowed hope whole. This was a country of cruelties. The sun was a tyrant, beating down from a pale, bleached sky, baking the earth into a cracked and blistered shell. It burned through her worn calico dress and the thin blanket she draped over Samuel's head. Water was a prayer, a mirage shimmering in the distance, a memory of taste that turned to ash on the tongue. They measured their lives in the slosh of the last canteen, in the frantic search for a muddy seep or a hidden spring. At night, the heat reluctantly gave way to a deceptive cool, but the land's dangers did not sleep. They made their camp in the meager shelter of a rocky outcrop or a lonely mesquite tree. Clara would lay out their single bedroll, her body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. She would lie awake for hours, a pistol her husband had left her resting heavy in her hand, her ears straining against the vast, whispering dark. More than once, she had woken to the dry, rustling slither of a rattlesnake investigating their camp, its nearness a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She'd learned to check their bedroll with a stick before lying down, to shake out Samuel's small boots every morning. The fear was a constant, metallic taste in her mouth. It had been 3 days since they'd last seen another soul. 3 days since the dusty track they were following had dissolved into nothing but rock and sagebrush. The cattle were moving slower. Their heads hung low. One of the older cows had stumbled that morning and had been slow to get up. Clara knew what that meant. They were at the end of their rope, and so was she. Desperation was no longer a wave that washed over her. It was the sea she was drowning in. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was another trick of the heat, a phantom shape shimmering on the horizon. But as they trudged onward, the shape solidified. A structure, a ranch. It was a stark and lonely sight. A single, unpainted wooden house and a large barn sitting squat against the endless sky, looking as if they had been dropped there by a careless god and forgotten. A thin thread of smoke curled from a stone chimney, a fragile sign of life in the vast emptiness. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through Clara's exhaustion. She adjusted Samuel in her arms, his breath coming in hot, shallow puffs against her neck. He was starting to burn with fever. There was no more time. "Hold on, Sammy," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Just a little longer. We're going to find shelter." The walk to the ranch felt like the longest mile of her life. The silence that surrounded the place was immense, broken only by the groaning of a windmill and the lowing of her own weary cattle. As she drew closer, she saw that the place was worn but well tended. The fences were taut, the barn door hung straight on its hinges, and a small vegetable patch near the house showed signs of recent watering. This was the home of a man who worked, a man who endured. A large black dog with a white-tipped tail came bounding from behind the barn, barking with a ferocity that sent a fresh jolt of fear through Clara. It stopped a dozen yards away, its teeth bared, a low growl rumbling in its chest. Then a man emerged from the barn. He was tall and broad, his frame filling the dark rectangle of the doorway. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. He wore dusty denim trousers and a faded blue shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and tanned dark by the sun. His face was all angles and shadows under the brim of a sweat-stained hat, his features obscured by a thick, dark beard. He did not speak. He simply stood there, watching her approach, his stillness more unnerving than the dog's aggression. "Mister," Clara called out, her voice thin and shaky. "Mister, please, my son. He's sick. We need water, a place to rest, just for a bit." The man said nothing. His eyes, the color of slate under a stormy sky, moved from her face, down to the fever-flushed cheeks of her son, and then to the pathetic herd of cattle that had limped to a halt behind her. There was no pity in his gaze, no curiosity, nothing but a flat, hard assessment. "Keep moving," he said finally. His voice was a low rumble, rough as gravel. "This ain't a charity." The word struck her like a physical blow. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and shameful. She had expected this, had braced herself for it, but the reality of his coldness was staggering. She looked down at Samuel, whose eyes were now half closed, his small body limp in her arms. This was it. There was nowhere else to go. "Please," she begged, taking a hesitant step forward. The dog growled a warning. "I have cattle. I'll trade you, all of them, for a roof over our heads, for food, just until my boy is well." She was offering everything she had in the world, her last desperate gamble. The man's gaze flickered over her cattle again, a long, unreadable look. He seemed to be weighing their worth, and by extension, hers. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind and the creak of the windmill. Clara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. He took a step out of the barn's shadow, and for the first time, she saw his face more clearly. It was a hard face, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and solitude. There was an old, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow, but it was his eyes that held her. They were old eyes in a not-so-old face, eyes that had seen too much and felt too little for a long, long time. He looked at Samuel again. The boy let out a small, pained whimper in his sleep, a flicker of something, not kindness, not yet, but something less than stone, passed through the man's expression. It was a subtle shift, a slight easing of the tension in his jaw. He let out a heavy sigh, a sound of profound weariness. "The barn," he said, jerking his head toward the large structure he'd just exited. "You can stay in the barn. There's a clean stall in the back." Relief washed over Clara so powerfully her knees went weak. "Thank you," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. "God bless you, Mister." He gave a short, humorless grunt, as if to say God had no business here. He whistled sharply, and the dog immediately fell silent, trotting back to his side. Without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the barn. Clara led her small herd to the corral beside the barn, her hands fumbling with the gate latch. The cattle, smelling water in a nearby trough, shuffled in without protest. She left them there, her supposed bargaining chips, and carried Samuel into the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay, leather, and animal sweat. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light slanting through the cracks in the walls. Just as he'd said. A stall in the back had been cleared out. The floor was covered with a thick, clean layer of straw. It was the most welcoming sight Clara had seen in months. She gently laid Samuel down, pulling their bedroll from her shoulder and spreading it over the straw. She took the canteen and moistened a piece of cloth, dabbing at her son's hot forehead. He stirred but didn't wake. She worked quietly, trying to make their small corner as comfortable as possible, her body moving with an exhaustion so complete it felt like a dream. She was so focused on her son that she didn't hear the man return. "Here." She jumped, startled. He was standing just outside the stall, holding a wooden bucket of fresh water and a tin cup. He set them down on the ground just inside the stall. "Careful not to come any closer." "Food'll be ready in an hour," he said, his back already to her as he walked away. Clara stared after him. He was a man of few words and no comfort, but he had given them water and shelter. It was more than anyone else had. When she felt Samuel was settled, she went to the farmhouse. The door was slightly ajar. She knocked softly. "Come in," his voice rumbled from inside. She pushed the door open and stepped into a sparse, clean room that served as a kitchen and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a small fire crackling within. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. The man, Eli, she had heard him call his dog by that name and assumed it was his own, was standing by the hearth, stirring something in a black iron pot. "Mr.," she began, twisting her hands in the fabric of her skirt. "About the cattle." He didn't turn around. "Name's Eli." "Mr. Eli," she corrected herself. "About the cattle. They're yours, all 12, for letting us stay, for the food." He stopped stirring and slowly turned to face her. He leaned back against the stone of the hearth, crossing his arms over his broad chest. His gaze was intense, searching. It made her feel small and transparent, as if he could see every hardship, every shame, every secret she carried. "I don't want your cattle," he said, his voice low and even. Clara's heart sank. "But I have nothing else. It's all I have to offer." "I'm not trading for a woman and her sick child," he stated, and there was an edge to his voice now, something defensive, almost angry. He pushed himself off the mantel and walked to the table. He pulled out a chair for her, a gesture so common, yet, from him, it was startling. He looked her straight in the eye. "I don't want gold or cattle," he said, his voice dropping again, losing its edge. "But don't go anywhere tonight." It wasn't a question, it wasn't a threat, it was a simple, undeniable statement of fact. "You will stay." She nodded, unable to find her voice, and sat down at the table. Dinner was a silent affair. Eli ladled a thick, hot stew into 2 tin bowls and set a loaf of dark bread between them. He fetched Samuel's portion and took it to the barn himself, returning as silently as he'd left. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin, the crackle of the fire, and the relentless howl of the wind outside the cabin walls. Clara was acutely aware of him. She felt his presence like a physical weight in the small room. He ate slowly, methodically, as if it were a task to be completed, several times. She looked up to find him watching her. His gaze wasn't improper or judgmental. It was considering, slow and heavy, like a man studying a map of a strange new land, unsure of its terrain. It made her skin prickle, not with fear, but with a strange, unsettling awareness. She was used to being looked at by men, looked through, looked down upon, or looked at with a raw, possessive hunger. This was different. This was just looking, and it was somehow more unnerving than anything she had ever known. When they were finished, he took her bowl, washed it in a basin of water, and set it on a shelf to dry. He moved around the small space with a familiarity that spoke of years of solitude. Every object had its place. Every movement had a purpose. There was no wasted motion, no wasted words. "You can take the bed," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a small alcove where a simple cot was tucked away. "I'll take the floor by the fire." "No," Clara said quickly. "I couldn't. The barn is fine. It's more than enough." He just looked at her, his expression unchanging. "The boy's got a fever. A cold floor won't do him any good. Bring him in here. It's warmer." He was not offering. He was commanding. Clara found herself nodding again. She fetched Samuel, who was still lost in a feverish sleep, and settled him onto the cot, tucking the coarse wool blanket snugly around his small frame. Eli had already laid out a bedroll for himself on the floor, his back to them, affording her a small measure of privacy. She sat in the chair by the cot, watching her son's chest rise and fall, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a fragile, burgeoning relief. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Eli lay still on the floor, a dark, unmoving shape. Clara assumed he was asleep. The exhaustion she had been holding at bay for days finally began to claim her, her head nodding forward. Then she heard it. A soft, hesitant sound cutting through the silence of the cabin. It was music, plucked from the strings of a banjo or a simple guitar. The notes were quiet, almost timid, as if afraid to disturb the night. It was a simple melody, achingly sad, a tune that spoke of profound and solitary grief. It stumbled at times, a note missed here and there, but the feeling behind it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a heart breaking silently, over and over, in the dark. Clara sat perfectly still, listening. The music seemed to seep into the very wood of the cabin, filling the small space with a sorrow so deep it was almost tangible. She looked over at the shape on the floor. Eli hadn't moved, but she knew it was him. This was his voice. This was the language of the man who had none. The mournful notes pulled at something inside her, unraveling the tight knot of control she had maintained for so long. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, then another and another. She cried silently, her shoulders shaking with a grief she hadn't allowed herself to feel for her husband, for her lost home, for the life she might have had. But as she listened to the lonely music in the darkness, she knew she wasn't just crying for herself. She was crying for him, too, for the stranger on the floor, a man who spoke in silence and wept in song. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Samuel's fever broke on the second morning, leaving him weak but lucid, his curious blue eyes taking in the strange new world of Eli's cabin. For Clara, the passing of the fever felt like the first true sunrise after a long and starless night. Gratitude was a living, breathing thing inside her, so immense it left little room for the fear that had been her constant companion. She could not, would not, be a burden. She rose before dawn each morning, the same as Eli. While he went out to tend to his stock and the endless chores of a one-man ranch, she claimed the cabin as her domain. She swept the rough-hewn floorboards, scrubbed the small, grimy window until the morning light streamed in clear and bright, and learned the quirks of the old wood-burning stove. She found a small sack of flour and another of cornmeal, and soon the cabin, which had for so long smelled only of wood smoke, dust, and solitude, began to smell of baking bread and simmering stew. She washed their few clothes in a basin with harsh lye soap and hung them on a line Eli had strung between two porch posts, watching them snap and dance in the relentless wind. Work was a balm. It was a purpose, in the methodical kneading of dough or the steady rhythm of a broom against the floor. She could momentarily silence the ghosts of her past. She was earning her keep, she told herself. This was a fair trade. Eli remained a creature of silence. He would enter the cabin for meals, his presence filling the small space, and eat whatever she had prepared without comment. But his approval was there, in the way he would finish every last scrap on his plate, or the time he paused for a fraction of a second to inhale the scent of fresh bread before sitting down. They rarely spoke more than a few necessary words. "More coffee?" she'd ask. "Yes," he'd rumble. "It's cold out," he might state. leaving a fresh pile of firewood by the hearth. "Thank you," she would reply. Yet, in the quiet, his actions spoke volumes. One morning, she awoke to find a second, thicker wool blanket laid neatly over the foot of the cot where she and Samuel slept. She had never said she was cold. Another afternoon, as she struggled to haul 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, he appeared from the barn, took them from her hands without a word, and carried them to the cabin door. He never made a show of it. The help was always practical, silent, and offered from a slight distance. He noticed the porch roof drip during a brief, violent rainstorm. The next day, she heard him hammering up above, and the dripping stopped. These small, unspoken kindnesses were more unsettling to Clara than cruelty would have been. Cruelty, she understood. She knew its language, its logic. This quiet consideration was foreign territory. It asked for nothing in return, and that frightened her. It made this arrangement feel less like a transaction and more like something she couldn't define, something that might have a cost she couldn't yet see. For Eli, the woman's presence was a disturbance to a solitude he had carefully cultivated for a decade. Her scent of soap and baking bread clung to the air in his cabin, a constant reminder that he was no longer alone. He watched her from the corner of his eye as he worked, her movements efficient and graceful as she went about her tasks. He saw the deep weariness in her shoulders, but also the fierce, stubborn set of her jaw. And he watched the boy, Samuel. He saw the way the child's health returned, the pale cheeks gaining a touch of color. He watched him play with a set of wooden blocks Clara had carved for him from a piece of scrap wood. The sight of the small boy, so full of a life that had almost been extinguished, was a sharp, painful splinter in his heart. It reminded him of another child, another life. The memory always came unbidden, sharp and brutal as a shard of glass. It ambushed him in the quiet moments, while he was mending a fence line, the sun hot on his back, or when he saw the boy's small shadow fall across the dusty yard. The town was Abilene. The air was thick with dust and the tension of cattle money. He was younger then, quicker on the draw than he was with his sense of judgment. He wasn't a lawman, just a man who wore a gun and sold its services to whoever paid the highest. A rancher named Harrison had hired him, claiming a rival. A man named Cole was rustling his cattle. The instructions were simple. Make Cole and his men back down. An example needed to be set. He'd found Cole in the saloon, as expected, but his wife, Sarah, had been with him that day. She'd come into town for supplies, bringing their daughter, Lily, who was 6 years old and had her mother's bright, copper-colored hair. He saw them through the saloon window, Sarah handing Lily a piece of candy from the general store across the street. He should have waited. A smart man, a careful man, would have waited. But he was full of pride and Harrison's whiskey. He'd called Cole out. The street went silent, the way it always did. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sun. He remembered the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze. Cole came out, his 2 ranch hands behind him. They were drunk and angry. Eli was faster. His first shot was true, hitting Cole square in the chest, but one of the ranch hands, wild with panic, had fired blindly. The shot went wide, shattering the window of the general store. And then the screaming started. Not the shouts of men in a gunfight, but the high, terrified shriek of a woman. Eli's blood ran cold. He saw it in flashes. A nightmare burned into his memory. Sarah, his Sarah, rushing toward the store. Lily, on the ground. A small, crumpled pile of calico. A dark stain spreading on her dress. Sarah had knelt beside her, gathering her into her arms. And that's when the second wild shot had hit her in the back. It had all happened in less than a minute. He had stood there, his Colt still smoking in his hand, the man he was paid to shoot dead at his feet, and across the street, his entire world had been extinguished by a stray bullet fired in a fight he had started. He'd killed the other 2 men. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was an execution. When the smoke cleared, the silence that descended on the street was heavier than any tombstone. He had walked, woodenly, across the dusty street to where his wife and daughter lay. He remembered kneeling, reaching out, and then pulling his hand back, unable to touch them, his hands suddenly feeling like they were covered in their blood. He had made a decision, and for that decision, his family had paid the price. That was the truth of it. He had traded their lives for a bag of coins and a moment of stupid pride. He shook his head, the scrape of the currycomb against a horse's flank bringing him back to the present. The barn, his sanctuary, felt smaller today. The ghost of his daughter's laughter seemed to echo in the rafters. He had built this ranch on a foundation of grief and sealed himself inside it. Now, there were cracks in the walls. One evening, as Clara was mending a tear in Samuel's only shirt by the light of the fire, Eli spoke, his voice startling her out of her concentration. "Your husband," he said. It wasn't a question, but an opening. "What happened to him?" Clara's needle froze in mid-stitch. She kept her eyes down, focused on the small piece of fabric in her hands. The lie was ready on her tongue, smooth and practiced. She had told it to herself so many times it almost felt real. "It was an accident," she said, her voice quiet and even. "Last winter, he was out clearing a fallen tree after a big snow. A branch. It broke loose. It was over quickly." She didn't look at him. She couldn't, because the truth was a venomous, ugly thing. The truth was that her husband, Thomas, had not died in a tragic accident. He had died of a fever, in a bed he had soiled, his body weakened by drink and a mean spirit that had corroded him from the inside out. There was no nobility in his death, and there had been no peace in their life together. The truth was that Thomas had never seen her as a wife, but as chattel. He was a man of weak character and violent temper, who saw bruises on his wife's skin as marks of ownership. She remembered the nights he'd come home from the saloon, his eyes glazed with whiskey, his words slurring into fists. She remembered him losing their last few dollars in a card game and offering the winner a night with her to clear his debt. She had been a commodity, an object to be used, traded, and discarded. The scar hidden beneath the collar of her dress, a thin white line from the time he'd thrown a plate at her, was a permanent reminder. The story of the falling branch was a kindness, a small mercy she gave to his memory for Samuel's sake, and for her own. To admit the truth would be to admit the depth of her shame, the totality of her degradation. "I'm sorry," Eli said, and the simple words were so unexpected, so sincere, that they almost broke her resolve. She just nodded, pulling the thread tight, her knuckles white. "He left us the cattle," she added, as if that explained everything. "It's a good herd." Another lie. The herd was as starved and broken as she was. A week turned into 2. The wind still howled, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace had taken root. Samuel was laughing again, a sound that Clara realized she hadn't heard in almost a year. He followed Eli around like a shadow, watching him mend tack or shoe a horse, his small face a mask of silent awe. Eli, for his part, never shooed him away. Sometimes. Clara would see him showing the boy how to tie a knot, or letting him hold the handle of a tool, his large, calloused hand guiding Samuel's small one. But the nights were the hardest. When the work was done and the cabin was quiet, the ghosts returned for both of them. One night, a chill had set in, a deep, biting cold that promised an early winter. Clara awoke from a restless sleep. The blankets not enough to keep the cold from seeping into her bones. The fire was low, and Eli's spot on the floor was empty. A sliver of moonlight cut through the window, illuminating the vacant bedroll. A vague unease settled over her. She slipped out of the cot, careful not to wake Samuel, and pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders. She peered through the window. In the pale, ethereal light of the moon, she saw him. He was sitting on the top rail of the corral fence, his back to the house, a solitary figure staring out into the vast, dark emptiness of the plains. He wore only his shirt and trousers, seemingly oblivious to the knife-like cold. Something in his utter stillness called to her. It was the same desolate loneliness she had heard in his music. Before she could think, before her fear and caution could stop her, she was acting. She grabbed the heavy wool blanket from his bedroll, quietly opened the cabin door, and slipped out into the cold. The ground was frozen hard under her bare feet, but she barely felt it. The wind whipped at her nightgown, but she kept her eyes fixed on the dark shape of the man on the fence. He didn't move as she approached, and for a moment, she wondered if he was even aware of her presence. She stopped just behind him. She could see the faint puff of his breath in the frigid air. She could feel the powerful stillness emanating from him, a wall of grief and solitude he had built around himself. Her heart pounded. This was foolish. He was a stranger, a hard, silent man. But she remembered the extra blanket he had given her. She remembered the buckets of water. She remembered the sad, broken music in the dark. Hesitantly, she reached out and unfolded the blanket, draping it over his broad shoulders. Her fingers brushed against the rough fabric of his shirt, and through it, the solid warmth of his back. He flinched at the contact, a sudden, sharp jerk of his entire body, as if he'd been burned. He twisted around on the rail, his face a mask of shock in the moonlight, his eyes wide and dark. They stared at each other. The wind howled around them, a lonely, keening sound. In that moment, the wall he kept around himself seemed to crumble. She saw past the hardened exterior to the raw, aching loneliness beneath. His eyes, which had always been so guarded and distant, were now stripped bare, filled with a decade of unspoken pain and a deep, desperate longing that mirrored the one hidden in her own heart. It was a hunger not of the flesh, but of the soul, the need to be seen, to be touched, to be known. He slowly raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, hesitant, as if he were touching something impossibly fragile. "I haven't," he began, his voice a raw, broken whisper, thick with emotion. "I haven't touched another soul in 10 years. The vulnerability in his voice, in his touch, was too much. It was too close to the raw wound inside her. All her own fears, her own feelings of worthlessness, came rushing back. The voice of her husband was in her ear, telling her she was ugly, useless, soiled. She flinched back, breaking the contact, her arms wrapping around herself. "Don't," she whispered, her gaze falling to the frozen ground. I'm not beautiful. I'm not the kind of woman a man like you should." Her voice trailed off, choked with a shame she couldn't name. She was damaged goods, a widow with nothing to her name but a sick child and a lie. What could she possibly offer a man but more trouble, more grief? Eli slid off the fence, landing silently on the ground in front of her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He gently took her by the arms, his grip firm but not harsh, forcing her to look at him. "Clara," he said, his voice low and intense. He had never used her name before. It sounded strange and intimate in the cold night air. He interrupted her before she could speak again, his eyes holding hers, demanding she hear him, demanding she understand. "I'm not buying you with cattle," he whispered, his voice resonating with a fierce sincerity that cut through all her defenses. "I just want you to choose to stay." Eli's words that night at the corral, "I just want you to choose to stay," were a key turning a lock deep inside Clara. The choice, freely given, was a gift she had never known. It untethered her from the desperate refugee she had been and allowed her to plant roots, however shallow, in the hard-packed earth of his ranch. She chose to stay. Every morning, when she woke to the sound of his movements in the pre-dawn dark, she made the choice again. The ranch began to change under her touch. It was no longer just Eli's solitary outpost. It was a home taking its first hesitant breaths. She scrubbed the floors not as a chore, but as if polishing her own hearth. She found a patch of stubborn wildflowers near the creek bed and transplanted them into empty food tins, setting them on the windowsill where they caught the morning sun. The splash of purple and yellow was a defiant act of beauty against the endless brown and gray of the landscape. She took one of Eli's worn-out shirts, its fabric softened by years of wear, and painstakingly stitched it into a new, smaller shirt for Samuel. Her work was no longer a currency to pay for shelter. It was an investment. When she tended the small vegetable garden, she was tending their future meals. When she mended a seam in Eli's jacket, she was mending the fabric of their shared life. A quiet sense of ownership grew within her. This place, this fragile sanctuary, was hers to protect as much as it was his. The most profound change, however, was in the space between Eli and her son. The tentative bond between the quiet man and the curious boy slowly blossomed into something that looked remarkably like family. Eli began to teach him things, not with grand pronouncements or lengthy lessons, but in his own silent, methodical way. He started with the horses. He had a gentle, aging mare named Dust Devil who was as patient as the mountains. One afternoon, Clara watched from the porch as Eli lifted Samuel onto the mare's broad, bare back. Samuel's small hands gripped the coarse mane, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Eli didn't let go. He kept one hand firmly on Samuel's back, the other on the horse's neck, and walked them in slow, deliberate circles around the corral. He spoke in a low, calm voice, not to the boy, but to the horse, his words a soft rumble that seemed to soothe them both. Day after day, the lesson was repeated until Samuel could sit upright on his own, his small body learning the rhythm of the horse's gait, a proud, toothy grin spreading across his face. Then came the lessons with a rifle. It was an old, single-shot .22, small enough for a boy to handle. Eli didn't teach him to be a gunslinger. He taught him respect. He spent an hour showing Samuel how to clean it, how to check that it was unloaded, how to hold it so that it became an extension of his own eye. He set up empty tins on a fence post 50 yards away. "Breathe out slow," Eli murmured, his large frame bent over Samuel's small one, his hand guiding the barrel. "Don't jerk the trigger. Squeeze it, like you're shaking a man's hand for the first time." The first shot kicked up dust a foot below the target. The second went wide. But the third, by some miracle, struck a can with a satisfying plink. Samuel whooped with delight, turning to look at Eli with shining, hero-worshipping eyes. Eli's face, for the first time Clara could recall, softened into something that was almost a smile. He simply nodded and placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, watching them from the kitchen window, her hands covered in flour. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. This was the father Samuel had never had. This was the gentle strength her husband had so violently lacked. In these moments, the three of them, the silent man, the hopeful woman, the growing boy, were a family, forged not by blood or law, but by a shared need for refuge. But their small, isolated world could not remain an island forever. The nearest town, Redemption, was a full day's ride away, a dusty collection of buildings that served as the region's only hub for supplies and gossip. Eli had to make the trip once a month. The first time he went after she and Samuel had arrived. He returned with the usual sacks of flour and salt, but he also brought back a small bag of lemon drops for Samuel and a bolt of plain blue calico cloth for her. He had set them on the table without a word, his face unreadable. Clara had simply touched the smooth fabric, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. The next time he returned from town, however, something was different. The lemon drops and the thoughtful gift were absent. He was quieter than usual, a new tension settling in his shoulders. He seemed to retreat back into the hard shell she had first encountered, and a chill of unease crept back into the cabin. The outside world arrived a week later, not as a whisper, but as a thundering of hooves. 4 men rode into the yard, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. They were not weary travelers seeking shelter. They carried themselves with an arrogant swagger, their saddles ornate, their guns holstered in polished leather. The man in the lead was stout, with a florid face and small, greedy eyes. He dismounted as if he owned the ground he stood on. Eli emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his body instantly alert and rigid. He positioned himself between the riders and the house, a silent, immovable obstacle. "Eli!" the lead man boomed, a false heartiness in his voice that didn't reach his eyes. "Jedediah Thorne. We met in town last week. Heard you'd come into some new assets." Thorne's eyes flickered past Eli to the cabin door, where Clara now stood, her hand clutching the frame. His gaze roamed over her, insolent and appraising, as if she were another head of cattle to be priced. "We're here to make you a fair offer, Eli," Thorne continued, ignoring Clara. "This parcel of land is dry, but it controls the access to the creek. My associates and I are consolidating our holdings. We'll give you $500. For the land, the cabin, the barn, and the herd." He smirked. "Seems you've acquired a decent little starter herd." Eli's face was stone. "The land's not for sale." Thorne chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Don't be a fool. A man like you, all alone out here. What do you need with all this? Take the money. Move on. There's nothing for you here." His eyes slid to Clara again. "Unless you've already spent the payment for your new housekeeper." The insult hung in the air, thick and vile. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. So this was it, the town's verdict. She was the loner's whore, the woman who'd traded her body for a roof. The lie was so much uglier than the complex, fragile truth. "You have 1 week to reconsider our offer," Thorne said, his voice losing all pretense of friendliness. It was cold, hard, and sharp as a blade. "After that, the price might go down, and things might get difficult for you, for all of you." He swung himself back onto his horse, and the 4 men wheeled their mounts around, laughing amongst themselves as they rode away, leaving a trail of dust and poison in their wake. The silence they left behind was heavy, suffocating. The fragile peace of the last month had been shattered. Clara looked at Eli. His back was still to her, but she could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The sanctuary had been breached. That night, she couldn't eat. She couldn't sit still. The fear that she had managed to keep at bay had returned, a cold, sickening serpent coiling in her gut. She knew men like Thorne. They were predators who scented weakness and never let go of their prey. They would not stop. They would take what they wanted, and they would crush anyone who stood in their way. She had learned that lesson on her own skin. She found Eli in the barn, currying Dust Devil with long, hard strokes, his movements filled with a controlled violence. The air was thick with the scent of horse and hay and his simmering rage. "Eli," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't stop, didn't look at her. "Go back to the house, Clara." "You should sell it," she blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in her haste. "He's right. It's just land. $500 is more than enough to start over somewhere else. Somewhere they don't know us. We can take Samuel and just go." It was the only solution she had ever known. To run, to flee before the violence came. Her only concern was protecting this man and her son from the trouble she had brought to their door. He finally stopped. He dropped the brush and turned to face her, his eyes blazing in the lantern light. "There is no somewhere else," he said, his voice low and guttural. "Men like that are everywhere. Running is what they expect." "But they'll hurt you," she cried, taking a step closer. "Or worse. For what? A piece of dry land and a handful of bony cattle? It's not worth your life." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that seemed to peel back every layer of her fear. His expression softened, the hard anger in his eyes replaced by a deep, immovable sorrow. "When my wife and daughter were killed," he said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it over the rising wind outside. "I ran. I left my whole life behind. I came out here where I wouldn't have to feel anything, where I couldn't hurt anyone, and no one could hurt me. This place, this land, it wasn't a home. It was a tomb." He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "And then you showed up, with your boy." He shook his head, a look of grim wonder on his face. "I've lost one family. Clara, I stood by and let it happen." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he gently touched her cheek. "I will not let anyone take another." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Another family. He meant them. He meant her and Samuel. He wasn't defending the land. He was defending them. He was choosing to stand his ground. Not for a piece of property, but for a home he had only just realized he had. As if on cue, the sky opened up. The rising wind brought with it a torrent of rain, a sudden, violent downpour that hammered against the barn's tin roof like a drumbeat of war. A fierce gust of wind tore at the side of the barn, and with a loud crack, a section of the roof sheeting was ripped loose, flapping wildly and letting in a cascade of cold, driving rain. "The hay!" Eli yelled over the roar of the storm. Instinct took over. They worked together, a frantic, desperate dance against the elements. He grabbed a ladder while she hauled a heavy canvas tarp from a corner. He scrambled up the ladder into the hayloft, and she followed, pushing the heavy tarp up to him. Rainwater was pouring in, soaking the precious winter feed for the animals. They wrestled with the heavy, sodden canvas, fighting the wind that tore through the new opening in the roof. They were shouting to be heard over the storm, their bodies moving in unison, their hands brushing, their shoulders bumping in the cramped, dark space. Finally, they managed to drag the tarp over the hole and secure its corners with heavy stones and pieces of broken equipment. The deluge was reduced to a muffled drumming, the wind to a low moan. They were left in the semi-darkness of the hayloft, breathing heavily, their clothes plastered to their skin, their hair dripping with rainwater. They turned to face each other at the same moment. The urgency of the storm was gone, replaced by a different kind of intensity. The air in the loft was thick, charged with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. All the fear, the anger, the unspoken longing of the past weeks culminated in this one breathless moment. This time, there was no avoidance. Her eyes met his, and she did not look away. She saw the fierce protectiveness there, but underneath it, she saw the vulnerable man who played sad songs in the dark. He looked at her and saw not a housekeeper or a refugee, but the woman who had put wildflowers on his windowsill, the woman he would stand and fight for. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling, and gently traced the line of her jaw, his thumb stroking her rain-slicked cheek. It was the same hesitant touch from the night at the corral, but now there was a certainty behind it, a raw, undeniable need. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, hungry, a release of a decade of loneliness and a month of unbearable tension. It was the rain and the wind and the fear and the hope all crashing together. She clung to him, her hands tangling in his wet hair, answering his raw hunger with her own. He broke the kiss, his breathing ragged, his forehead resting against hers. His hands slid from her face down to her shoulders, then to her waist. They were shaking, his control frayed. With unsteady fingers, he found the knotted ties of her dress at the small of her back, fumbling with the wet fabric. He was moving too fast, driven by a powerful current of long-suppressed desire. Clara felt a flicker of the old fear, the memory of being taken without thought or tenderness. But this was not Thomas, this was Eli. She placed her hands over his, stilling his frantic movements. He froze, looking at her with a question in his eyes, a fear that he had misread everything. She gave him a small, watery smile. "Don't rush," she whispered. her voice barely audible over the storm. It was not a rejection. It was an invitation, a plea for a gentleness she had never known, a request that he see her, not just the body he craved. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a wave of profound tenderness. The frantic hunger in his expression softened into something deeper, more reverent. He let out a shaky breath and nodded, his whole body relaxing. He pulled his hands away from the ties of her dress. Instead, he simply wrapped his arms around her, pulling her soaked body against his. He held her tightly, his chin resting on the top of her head, his arms a circle of solid warmth and safety. She pressed her face into his chest, inhaling the scent of rain, hay, and him. The drumming of the storm on the roof was the only sound, a rhythm that matched the beating of their two hearts. He didn't try to kiss her again. He didn't touch her. He just held her, and in that simple, profound embrace, surrounded by the storm, Clara felt safer than she had ever felt in her entire life. They stood like that for hours, two souls finding shelter in each other as the long, dark night raged on. The dawn broke, pale and bruised, over a world washed clean by the storm. The air was crisp and cold, scrubbed of dust. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was heavy and unsettled. Clara awoke on the cot, Samuel a warm weight beside her, with a fragile hope fluttering in her chest. The memory of the hayloft, the desperate kiss, the profound comfort of his arms around her, was a vivid, warming ember against the morning chill. She didn't know what she expected. A smile, perhaps, a shared glance, some acknowledgement that the world between them had irrevocably shifted. She received nothing. Eli was already up, fully dressed, stoking the fire. He moved with a stiff, mechanical precision that hadn't been there the day before. When he turned from the hearth, his eyes swept past her, not meeting her gaze. They were shuttered, distant, the familiar slate-gray walls rebuilt, thicker and higher than ever. "Morning," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion that had roughened it to a whisper just hours before. He poured himself a cup of coffee and went outside without another word. Clara sat up, the cold seeping into her bones. It was a more biting chill than the morning air could account for. It was the cold of confusion, of a hope abruptly extinguished. A hot flush of shame crept up her neck. Had she imagined it all? The tenderness in his eyes, the tremor in his hands. Had it just been a moment of weakness in a storm, a fleeting response to fear and proximity that meant nothing in the light of day? She felt foolish, exposed. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable with this man, had whispered, "Don't rush," believing it was the beginning of a conversation. Now, his silence told her it was the end. He was a man of solitude, and she, with her messy past and her dependent child, had trespassed. The embrace in the hayloft hadn't been a welcome. It had been a lapse in his defenses, one he now clearly regretted. The day was a long, silent agony. Eli avoided her with a deliberate, painful thoroughness. After a breakfast eaten in oppressive silence, he announced he was going to mend the fence line on the far side of the north pasture. It was a full day's work, a choice that would keep him as far from the cabin, and from her, as possible. He packed a piece of bread and some jerky, saddled his horse, and rode out without a backward glance. Clara threw herself into her chores with a frantic energy, trying to scrub away the hurt and humiliation. She beat the dust from the rugs with such violence that Samuel watched her with wide, concerned eyes. The cabin felt like a cage. The quiet that had once been peaceful now rang with unspoken rejection. Every tick of the small clock on the mantelpiece was a countdown to an inevitable, painful departure. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that they could not stay. The fragile balance had been broken. She had overstepped, had asked for something he was unwilling or unable to give. He returned at dusk, long after the sun had set, his face grim and streaked with dirt, his body slumped with a fatigue that seemed more emotional than physical. He ate the dinner she had left for him on the stove, standing by the hearth, his back to her. He tended to his horse, checked on the cattle, and moved through the evening rituals like a ghost in his own home. He said nothing to her, and his avoidance was so complete, so absolute. It was louder than any argument. Clara put Samuel to bed, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She knew what she had to do. There was no choice to be made anymore. He had made it for her. She would leave in the morning. Before he woke, she would slip away as quietly as she had arrived, a ghost erasing her own footsteps. As she was laying out their meager belongings on the bedroll, preparing for their flight, she heard the soft creak of the cabin door. She froze, thinking he was coming in, but the footsteps stopped on the porch. A moment later, she heard them retreat toward the barn. A sliver of curiosity warred with her resolve. She went to the door and peered out. On the rough planks of the porch, placed squarely in front of her door, were two objects. One was a gun. It was a small, elegant derringer with a pearl handle, the kind a woman might carry. It was an object of protection, a tool for a journey. The other was a scarf. It was made of faded blue silk, worn soft with time, and as she picked it up, a faint, ghostly scent of lavender and memory rose from its folds. It was a beautiful, intimate thing, a woman's thing. The meaning of the two objects struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. It was a message, delivered in his own silent, heartbreaking language. The gun was for her and Samuel, a practical, cold provision for the dangerous road ahead. You will need this to survive. The scarf was the reason. It belonged to the ghost who stood between them, the wife he still mourned, the family he had lost. It was his explanation and his dismissal in one. This is who my heart belongs to. I cannot give it to you. He was not just sending her away. He was telling her why she had to go. A fresh wave of pain washed over her, so sharp and profound it stole her breath. There was a terrible, tragic kindness in his gesture. He couldn't speak the words, so he had laid his heart, or what was left of it, on her doorstep. He was pushing her away not out of cruelty, but because he was incapable of moving on. He was a man trapped in his own past, and there was no room for her in it. Her resolve hardened. She would not make it harder for him. She would give him back his solitude. She went back inside and, by the low light of a single lamp, she wrote a note. Her hand shook, and a single tear splashed onto the cheap paper, smudging the ink. Mr. Eli, thank you for the shelter. Thank you for your kindness to my son. He will not forget it. Nor will I. I am sorry for the trouble I have brought you. May you find peace. Thank you for the home, however brief. Clara May Thompson. She folded it and left it on the table where he would see it. Then she gathered the sleeping Samuel into her arms, wrapped him in their bedroll, picked up the derringer, and slipped out into the night. She did not take the scarf. It was not hers to carry. The storm had returned, a cold, miserable drizzle that promised to turn into a downpour. The sky was starless, the landscape a featureless black. She did not dare take a horse. He would hear it. She set off on foot, heading east, toward redemption, though she had no real plan beyond putting as much distance between herself and the ranch as possible before morning. She moved through the darkness, a desperate, lonely figure, leaving behind the only place she had begun to feel safe. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours, the rain now falling in a steady, chilling sheet, when she heard the sound of hooves. It wasn't the sound of a single rider. It was several horses, moving at a trot through the darkness. A cold dread, sharper and more immediate than her sorrow, seized her. She pulled Samuel tighter against her and tried to melt back into the shadows of a rocky outcrop. But it was too late. They had seen her. 4 dark shapes materialized out of the rain-swept darkness, circling her. It was Thorn and his men. Well, look what we have here, Thorn's voice sneered. He leaned down from his saddle, a lantern held aloft, its yellow light illuminating her pale, rain-streaked face. "The little bird has flown the nest, and with her chick." "Leave us alone," Clara said, her voice trembling but defiant. She clutched the small derringer in her pocket, though she knew it was a useless gesture against 4 armed men. Thorn laughed. "Leave you alone? I don't think so. You see, you're valuable now. You're leverage." He nodded to one of his men. "Grab them. Your stubborn friend Eli might be more willing to negotiate for his land when he knows we have his bitch and her whelp." A rough hand grabbed her arm. Samuel woke up and started to cry, his frightened sobs cutting through the night. Clara struggled, but it was hopeless. They were laughing as they dragged her and her son through the mud, tying her hands, their touch rough and impersonal. They were nothing more than property to these men. Back at the ranch, Eli sat at his table, the folded note in his hand. He had found it moments ago. He had gone to the cabin to check on her, to try and explain the fear that had seized him, the terror that he was a curse and that anyone who got close to him would be destroyed. He had thought that by giving her the gun, by showing her the scarf, he was giving her a choice to escape him, to escape the danger that men like Thorn brought. He thought he was protecting her. But the simple, heartbreaking words on the page, "Thank you for the home," revealed the catastrophic depth of his folly. He hadn't pushed her toward safety. He had pushed her out into the storm, into the path of the very wolves he was trying to fend off. A guttural roar of rage and self-loathing tore from his throat. He swept the contents of the table to the floor in a single, violent motion. He had done it again. Through his own fear, his own silence, he had allowed his family, the new, fragile family he had just begun to accept, to be taken from him. He didn't hesitate. The paralysis of grief that had held him for 10 years was burned away by a white-hot, purifying rage. He grabbed his rifle from the wall mount and checked its load. He strapped on his Colt revolver, his movements swift and sure. He was no longer a grieving hermit. He was the man he used to be, the man who knew how to meet violence with violence. He burst out into the rain and threw a saddle on his fastest horse, his hands working with practiced speed. He saw their tracks in the mud, heading east. He swung into the saddle and spurred the horse into a gallop, a force of nature unleashed, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He rode like a demon, the rain and wind lashing at his face. He found them in a small, wooded clearing where they had made a crude camp. They had a fire going, and Clara and Samuel were tied to a tree. Thorn was standing over them, talking, his voice a low taunt. Eli didn't shout. He didn't announce his presence. He slid off his horse in the darkness, his rifle in his hand. The first crack of the rifle echoed through the trees, and one of Thorn's men, who had been standing guard, crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted. The men scrambled for their guns, firing blindly into the darkness. A second shot from Eli's rifle took down another man as he fumbled for his revolver. Gunpowder flashed in the dark, illuminating the scene in brief, hellish snapshots. Thorn, cursing, grabbed Clara, hauling her to her feet and pressing the barrel of his pistol to her head. "That's enough! Eli!" he screamed into the woods. "Or the woman dies now!" Eli stepped out from behind a tree, his rifle held loosely at his side. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat. "Let her go, Thorn." "The deed to your land," Thorn shouted, his voice high with panic. "Sign it over, or I'll kill her!" A shot rang out, not from Thorn, but from one of his men hiding behind the horses. The bullet slammed into Eli's left shoulder, spinning him around. He grunted in pain, dropping the rifle, but his right hand was already moving, drawing the Colt from his hip in a single, fluid motion. He fired twice. The third man fell. Now it was just him and Thorn. Eli stood, his left arm hanging useless at his side, blood already soaking his shirt, the heavy revolver in his right hand steady as a rock. "It's over," Eli said, his voice a low growl of pain and fury. Thorn, his eyes wild, began to drag Clara back toward his horse, still using her as a shield. But in his panic, he stumbled in the mud. For a fraction of a second, Clara was clear of him. It was all the time Eli needed. The Colt bucked in his hand. The shot was perfect. Thorn collapsed, a look of surprise on his face, and did not move again. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the sound of the rain and Samuel's terrified sobs. Clara, freed, scrambled through the mud to where Eli stood swaying, his face pale in the firelight. She reached him just as his legs gave out, catching him as he fell to his knees. Blood was pouring from his shoulder. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that went deeper than the bullet wound. She cradled his face in her hands, her own tears mingling with the rain. "You fool," she whispered, her voice thick with love and relief. "You stubborn, foolish man." She looked at the carnage around them, at the gun still smoking in his hand. "You didn't have to save me with a gun. Eli," she said, her voice breaking. "You just had to tell me you wanted me to stay." He looked up at her, his breathing shallow. A faint, pained smile touched his lips. "I can't," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't say the words. Clara." He reached up with his good hand and touched her cheek, his gaze holding hers. "But I feel it, every time I see you smile in the kitchen." The journey back to the ranch was a slow, agonizing crawl through mud and misery. Clara managed to get Eli onto his horse, his body a dead weight against her as she led the animal through the pre-dawn gloom, with Samuel clinging to her skirts. The bullet, lodged deep in his right shoulder, had shattered bone. By the time they reached the cabin, he was delirious with fever, his blood a stark, terrifying stain on his shirt. The weeks that followed were a blur of fear, exhaustion, and grim determination. Clara became a nurse, a ranch hand, and a mother all at once. She dug the lead from his shoulder with the point of a heated knife, a horrific task that left him unconscious and her shaking and sick. She packed the wound with poultices of yarrow and comfrey, herbs she'd learned about from her grandmother, her hands moving with a desperate, prayerful certainty. She fought his fever with cool rags and willow bark tea, sitting by his cot through the long nights, listening to his ragged breathing, her hand never far from his forehead. During the day, she did his work. She learned to milk their one cow, her city-soft hands clumsy at first, but growing stronger. She fed the horses, scattered grain for the chickens, and, with Samuel's help, hauled buckets of water until her arms ached with a fire that matched the pain in her heart. She was terrified. Every time Eli's fever spiked, every time he cried out in his delirium, she feared she would lose him, that this fragile sanctuary would be snatched away. But the fear was a fire that forged, not consumed. It burned away the last of her timidity, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. She would not let him die. She had chosen to stay, and this was the price of that choice. Eli floated in a sea of pain and memory. He was back in Abilene, the smell of gunpowder thick in his nostrils, the sound of his wife's scream echoing in his ears. He saw Thorn's face, contorted in a sneer. He felt the bullet tear into his flesh. But through the nightmare, there was a constant, gentle presence, a cool hand on his brow, a soft voice murmuring encouragement, the scent of soap and baking bread. Clara. She was an anchor in the storm of his fevered mind, a lighthouse guiding him back from the dark shores of the past. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to heal. The fever broke, leaving him weak and drenched in sweat, but lucid. The pain in his shoulder was a constant, throbbing beast, but his mind was clear, and he was utterly, completely helpless. This was a new kind of hell for a man who had defined himself by his strength and self-sufficiency. He could not sit up on his own. He could not feed himself. His right arm, his gun arm, the limb that had been the source of his power and his damnation, was a useless, bandaged weight. the fingers numb and unresponsive. The doctor, who made a rare visit from Redemption, confirmed what Eli already knew in his bones. The bullet had shattered the joint and torn through the nerves. He would have use of the arm, eventually. But the fine motor control, the lightning-fast reflexes required to draw and fire a gun, were gone forever. The gunfighter was dead, leaving only the man. And the man was broken. It was in this state of utter vulnerability that the last of his walls crumbled. He had no choice but to let Clara in. She cared for him with a tenderness that was both intimate and matter-of-fact. There was no room for modesty or shame in their small cabin, only the pressing needs of a wounded body. She helped him drink, holding the cup to his lips. She spoon-fed him broth and thin porridge, the same way she fed Samuel. And one morning, when he was finally strong enough to be moved, she bathed him. She heated the water on the stove, her movements calm and efficient, and helped him into a chair. She stripped away his soiled shirt with gentle hands, her touch clinical yet kind as she worked around the heavy bandages. She washed him with a soft cloth, her touch sure and steady on his chest, his good arm, his back. He sat, head bowed, a giant of a man made humble, his body exposed to her gaze, but there was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet, focused care. She was not seeing the feared gunman or the solitary rancher. She was seeing only him, the man, in all his weakness, and in her acceptance. He found a strange and profound peace. The most difficult ritual was the shave. His beard had grown thick and unruly during his fever. One afternoon, Clara came to his cot with a straight razor, a bowl of hot water, and a brush. "I'll try not to cut you," she said, her voice soft, a small smile playing on her lips. He just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He leaned his head back as she lathered his face, the warm foam smelling of lye soap. Her touch was incredibly gentle as she drew the sharp blade down his cheek. He could feel the slight tremor in her hand, a sign of her own nervousness, and the vulnerability of the moment was immense. His life was literally in her hands. He closed his eyes, surrendering to her touch, trusting her completely. In that small, domestic act, a bond was forged that was stronger than any vow. They were no longer a man and a woman living under the same roof. They were partners, a unit, a family in everything but name. As his strength returned, so did the rhythm of their life. He could walk now, and he would sit on the porch for hours, watching her and Samuel go about the chores, his useless right arm cradled in a sling. He felt a burning frustration at his own weakness, but it was tempered by a deep, quiet gratitude. He watched Clara coaxing the garden back to life, her face smudged with dirt, and he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost choked him. He had told her he felt something when she smiled in the kitchen, but it was more than that. Watching her live, watching her bring life back to him and his fallow ranch, made him feel as if he were breathing real air for the first time in 10 years. One evening, they were sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset, painting the vast, empty sky in shades of fiery orange and deep purple. Samuel was asleep inside. The air was cool and still. "Clara," Eli said, his voice quiet. She turned to him, her face soft in the twilight. He had no words. He had never been a man for them. Instead, he reached down with his good left hand and plucked a long, dry blade of grass from between the porch steps. It was a simple, humble thing, golden in the fading light. He took her left hand in his. Her fingers were calloused from work, no longer the soft hands of the woman who had first arrived at his door. They were the hands of a partner. Slowly, carefully, he looped the blade of grass around her fourth finger, tucking the end in to form a small, fragile ring. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a promise. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, shimmering in the last light of day. She looked from the simple ring of grass to his face. His eyes, for so long guarded and shadowed, were open to her completely. filled with a quiet, pleading hope. She didn't need a diamond. She didn't need gold. This blade of grass, taken from the earth they now shared, was the most precious thing she had ever been given. She leaned in and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss filled with acceptance and a deep, resounding joy. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes." 2 days later, they rode into redemption. They looked like what they were, a humble rancher and his wife-to-be, with their small son riding proudly between them on the saddle. Clara had mended her best dress, the blue calico Eli had bought her, and she had braided a blue ribbon into her hair. Eli wore a clean shirt, and though his right arm was still in a sling, he sat tall in the saddle, a quiet dignity about him. The office of the Justice of the Peace was a small, dusty room smelling of stale paper and chewing tobacco. The man behind the desk, a portly fellow named Silas Croft with a perpetually sour expression, looked them over with undisguised disdain. "State your business," he grunted, not bothering to look up from his ledger. "We've come to get married," Eli said, his voice steady. Croft finally looked up, his piggy eyes moving from Eli's sling to Clara's worn dress, and finally to Samuel, who was hiding behind Clara's skirts. He squinted. "I know you. You're the hermit from the old Miller place." His eyes narrowed further as he looked at Clara. "And I've heard of you, too." A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. "You're the widow, the one who came to him with a herd of cattle." He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. "Town's been talking. They say you made a trade, a roof over your head for a warm place in your bed." The words, spoken so crudely, so publicly, struck Clara like a slap. The blood drained from her face, and the room seemed to tilt. The whispers she had feared were now a shout, an official judgment. She felt the eyes of the clerk in the corner on her, hot with scorn. The shame was a physical thing, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. "That's a lie," Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Is it?" Croft sneered. "Doesn't matter. This is a decent town. We have standards. We don't just hand out marriage licenses to arrangements like yours. It would set a bad precedent." He waved a dismissive hand. "Now get out of my office. I'm a busy man." The humiliation was complete. Clara couldn't bear it. She turned, grabbing Samuel's hand, and fled from the office, tears blinding her. She just wanted to disappear, to run back to the isolation of the ranch where the world couldn't touch them, couldn't soil the clean, simple thing they had built. Eli stood frozen for a moment, watching her go. He looked at Croft, who was still smirking, triumphant in his petty cruelty, and something inside Eli, a dam of restraint that had held for a decade, finally broke. With a roar of pure, untempered rage, he swung his good left arm and smashed his fist through the glass window of the office door. The glass shattered, exploding outward onto the dusty boardwalk. People in the street stopped and stared. Croft jumped to his feet, his face pale with shock and fear. Eli ignored the blood now dripping from his knuckles. He pointed a trembling, bloodied finger at the cowering man. "You listen to me," he bellowed, his voice echoing down the street, raw with a pain and fury that came from a place deeper than just this moment. "That woman is more decent than anyone in this whole rotten town. She walked through hell and came out clean. She is my wife." He took a staggering step toward the broken door, his eyes wild, his whole body shaking with the force of his emotion. He wasn't just shouting at Croft anymore. He was shouting at the ghosts of his past, at the town that had judged him, at the God who had forsaken him. "And she saved me," he roared, his voice cracking. "She saved me from the darkness." He stumbled out onto the boardwalk, breathing heavily, the rage leaving him as quickly as it had come, replaced by a vast, aching emptiness. Clara was already halfway down the street, trying to untie their horse, desperate to flee. "Ma'am, sir." A quiet voice cut through the commotion. An old man had stepped out from the shadow of the general store. He was stooped with age, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were clear and kind. "I couldn't help but overhear," the old man said, his voice calm and steady. "What that man in there said, and what you said, son, it seems to me the Lord is less concerned with the ledgers of men like Silas Croft and more with the ledger of the heart." He offered a gnarled hand to Eli. "My name is Phineas. I was a preacher, a long time ago, back in Ohio. I'm retired now, but the authority to join two souls before God, that's a thing you never retire from." He smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "If you'll have me, I would be honored to marry you." The wedding took place the next evening, not in a church, but in their own cathedral. They stood in the open field behind the house, the tall grass whispering around them, the setting sun casting a golden glow on the world. Phineas, the old preacher, stood before them, his voice a gentle murmur against the vast silence of the plains. Samuel, scrubbed clean and wearing his mended shirt, stood beside Eli as his witness. Clara wore an old white dress she had found packed away in a trunk in the barn. It had belonged to Eli's wife. At first, she had refused, feeling like an imposter. But Eli had insisted, his eyes telling her that this was not about replacing the past, but about honoring it by building a new future. The dress was simple, made of worn cotton, but in the golden light, she looked beautiful. They spoke the simple, ancient vows. Phineas's words about love, honor, and cherishing were not just words. They were a benediction, a cleansing of the stain of redemption. This was their truth. As Phineas spoke, Eli leaned close to Clara, his lips brushing her ear so that only she could hear his own private vow. "I chose you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he would never show the world. "Not out of pity, not because I was lonely. I chose you because you make me want to live." A single, perfect tear traced a path down Clara's cheek as she turned to him, her heart so full it felt it might burst. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and as Eli, her husband, leaned in to kiss her, the simple blade of grass still on her finger, Clara knew she was finally, truly, home. Spring melted into a summer that was, for the first time in a decade, full of promise. The ranch, once a monument to one man's grief, began to breathe again. Under Clara's patient hands, the small vegetable patch Eli had maintained out of necessity doubled, then tripled in size, bursting with rows of sturdy corn, fat squashes, and sprawling bean vines. The wildflowers she had transplanted to the windowsill seemed to thrive on her attention, their bright colors a daily rebellion against the starkness of the land. The cattle, her pathetic inheritance, were no longer bony apparitions. With regular access to the creek and the new grass that carpeted the pastures after the rains, their ribs disappeared beneath sleek hides. They were a small herd, but a healthy one, a tangible sign of the ranch's rebirth. They worked together, a silent and efficient team. Eli's right arm remained a source of frustration, the fingers still clumsy and weak, but he learned to compensate. He taught his left hand to do the work of two, his movements slow and deliberate but effective. He could still mend a fence, his teeth gripping the staples while his left hand hammered them in. He could still lift and haul, his broad shoulders carrying the load. Clara became his right hand. In a way, she learned to anticipate his needs, handing him a tool before he asked, holding a board steady while he sawed. They moved around each other in a dance of shared purpose, a language of gestures and glances replacing the need for words. It was during one of these shared tasks, while they were repairing a section of the corral fence, that the word was finally spoken. Eli was showing Samuel how to hold a plank steady, his good hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "Hold it firm now, Samuel," Eli said, his voice a low rumble, "like you're holding back a bull." Samuel, his face a mask of concentration, pushed against the wood with all his might. "I'm holding it, Pa," he said, the name slipping out as naturally as a breath. The hammering stopped. Eli froze, his hand hovering in midair. He slowly turned his head and looked at the boy. Samuel, realizing what he'd said, looked up with wide, uncertain eyes, as if expecting a reprimand. Eli's face, so often a mask of stoic neutrality, seemed to crack. The hardness in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a look of stunned, profound emotion. He looked over at Clara, who was standing a few feet away, her own work forgotten, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her eyes were shining with tears. He looked back at Samuel, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, lighting his features in a way she had never seen before. It was like watching the sun rise after a long night. He reached out and ruffled the boy's hair. "You're doing a good job, son," he said, his voice thick. And that was all. The hammering resumed, but everything had changed. The word hung in the air, a beautiful, binding thing. He was no longer Mr. Eli. He was Pa. The family, which had existed in fact for months, was now whole in name. The world beyond their fences began to notice the change as well. The story of Eli's rampage and redemption had spread like wildfire, as he knew it would. But the tale had twisted in the telling. While Silas Croft painted it as the act of a dangerous madman, others who had witnessed it saw something else. They saw a man, broken and silent for a decade, roaring to life in defense of his woman. There was something primal and respectable in it. The story was no longer about a harlot and a hermit. It was about a man's fierce devotion. The shift was subtle at first. A neighboring rancher, a taciturn man named Henry, who had only ever given Eli a curt nod from a distance, rode over one day. His wagon had thrown a wheel a few miles down the track. He asked for help, but his eyes were full of a cautious curiosity, taking in the neat yard, the thriving garden, and the sight of Clara hanging laundry on the line, a child's shirt flapping next to a man's. Eli, with Clara and Henry's help, fixed the wheel. As he was leaving, Henry gestured to Eli's arm, still in a sling. "Heard you had some trouble in town," Henry said, not unkindly. "Trouble found me," Eli replied, his gaze flicking to Clara. Henry nodded, understanding passing between the two men. "Seems you found something else, too." He tipped his hat to Clara. "Ma'am." It was the first time anyone from the outside world had addressed her with a title of respect. On their next trip to town, the change was more pronounced. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but their tone had shifted from malicious to speculative. The stares were more curious than scornful. The clerk at the general store, who had previously ignored her, asked Clara if she needed help carrying her sacks to the wagon. She noticed people looking not just at her, but at Eli. They saw the way he walked beside her, his body a protective shield between her and the world. They saw the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching, a look of such unguarded tenderness that it silenced the ugliest of rumors. They saw him smile at his son, and the sight of the stoic, silent Eli smiling was a more powerful testimony than any sermon. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man, alive and whole, and it was clear that the woman beside him was the reason. One hot afternoon in late summer, a dust-caked wagon, pulled by a single, exhausted-looking mule, creaked to a halt in their yard. A woman sat on the driver's bench. She was young, her face etched with a familiar desperation, her dress little more than rags. In the back of the wagon, two small, silent children huddled together. Clara was on the porch, shelling beans into a large wooden bowl. She watched as the woman climbed down from the wagon, her movements stiff with weariness. The woman approached the house with the hesitant, fearful steps of someone who expects to be turned away. "Ma'am," the woman began, her voice a dry rasp. We're on our way to California. My husband, he died of a fever back in Kansas. We've run out of water and food. I don't have any money, but I can work. I'll do anything." Her eyes pleaded, but beneath the plea was a hard, brittle shame. Clara put down her bowl of beans. She looked at the woman's chapped lips, the hollows under her eyes, the two terrified faces peering from the back of the wagon. She saw a perfect, painful reflection of herself. Not so many months ago. She saw the same desperation, the same fear, the same willingness to bargain away her own dignity for the survival of her children. Eli emerged from the barn, his face grim and questioning. He walked over to stand beside Clara, his presence a silent, solid wall. Clara stood up and walked down the porch steps, stopping directly in front of the stranger. She looked into the woman's weary eyes. "You don't have to do anything," Clara said, her voice clear and kind. She reached out and placed a hand on the woman's arm. "My name is Clara. You and your children are welcome here. There's fresh water in the well, and stew on the stove." The woman stared at her, uncomprehending, tears welling in her eyes. "But I have nothing to pay you with." Clara smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that held all the pain of her past and all the strength of her present. "Here," she said softly, but with a conviction that resonated with the force of a commandment. "No one has to pay for a roof with their body." The woman's face crumpled, and she began to sob, the harsh, racking sounds of a dam of grief and fear finally breaking. Clara simply pulled the woman into an embrace, holding her as she wept, while Eli went to the wagon to help the children down. The cycle of grace, which had begun with a reluctant act of mercy in a barn, had come full circle. The sanctuary was now strong enough to shelter others. That night, after the stranger and her children were safely asleep in the barn, the same stall where she and Samuel had first found refuge, Eli and Clara sat before the fire. The flames crackled and danced, casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that comes from a deep and abiding understanding. Eli reached out with his good hand and gently turned her so her back was to him. He had seen the scar before, during the long weeks of her nursing him. A thin, white, puckered line near her shoulder blade, a relic of a past she never spoke of. He knew its origin was violent. He knew it was a source of her shame, one of the many reasons she had once whispered that she wasn't beautiful, wasn't worthy. She tensed as he traced the outline of the scar with his thumb, his touch feather light. She started to pull away, a reflexive instinct to hide her imperfections, to keep the ugliest parts of her story locked away. He held her gently but firmly. Stopping her, he leaned forward, the warmth of the fire on his face, and he pressed his lips to the scar. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence. It was an act of acceptance, of consecration. He was kissing the wound, honoring the pain she had endured, and erasing its power over her. He rested his cheek against her back, his voice a low, warm murmur against her skin. "There are no wounds," he whispered, "that you have to hide from me." The last of her defenses washed away. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, but they were not tears of shame or sorrow. They were tears of release. He knew her, all of her, the broken parts and the mended ones, and he loved her still. She was whole. Later, they lay in the bed they now shared, her back pressed against his chest, his good arm wrapped securely around her. Samuel slept soundly on the cot across the room. Outside, the wind began to rise, its lonely howl a familiar song across the vast, dark plains. It was a wild, untamable sound, a reminder of the harshness of the world that lay just beyond their walls. But inside the small cabin, the fire in the hearth burned low and steady, its embers glowing with a resilient, enduring heat. They slept, wrapped in a profound peace, their slow, even breaths, a quiet rhythm against the storm. The fire within was safe, and it was burning brightly. Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment down below and say hello. If you enjoyed our tale, please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel and sharing your thoughts. We'll have another story for you soon.